The Museum of Modern Art held a retrospective for Diane Arbus in 1972. In the Arbus show, 112 photographs were taken by one person, and all are similar. Instead of people whose appearances please, representative folk doing the human thing, the Arbus show lined up assorted monsters in borderline cases, most of them ugly, wearing grotesque or unflattering clothing, in dismal or barren surroundings, who have paused to pose and often to gaze frankly, confidentially at the viewer. Arbus's work does not invite viewers to identify with the pariahs and miserable-looking people she photographed. Humanity is not one. The Arbus photographs convey the anti-humanist message, which people of goodwill in the 1970s are eager to be troubled by, just as they wished in the 1950s to be consoled and distracted by a sentimental humanism. Arbus's photographs undercut politics by suggesting a world in which everybody is an alien, hopelessly isolated, immobilized and mechanical, crippled identities and relationships. The cool dejection of the Arbus retrospective both render history and politics irrelevant. The most striking aspect of Arbus's work is that she seems to have enrolled in one of art photography's most vigorous enterprises, concentrating on victims, on the unfortunate, but without the compassionate purpose that such a project is expected to serve. Her work shows people who are pathetic, pitiable, as well as repulsive, but it does not arouse any compassionate feelings. For what would be more correctly described as their disassociated point of view, the photographs have been praised for their candor and for an unsentimental empathy with their subjects. What is actually their aggressiveness toward the public has been treated as a moral accomplishment, that the photographs don't allow the viewer to be distant from the subject. More plausibly, Arbus's photographs, with their acceptance of the appalling, suggest a naivety which is both coy and sinister, for it is based on distance, on privilege, on a feeling what the viewer is asked to look at is really other. Buñuel, when asked once why he made movies, said that it was to show that this is not the best of all possible worlds. Arbus took photographs to show something simpler, that there is another world. The other world is to be found, as usual, inside this one. Avowedly interested only in photographing people who look strange, Arbus found plenty of material close to home. New York, with its drag balls and welfare hotels, was rich with freaks. There was also a carnival in Maryland, where Arbus found a human pincushion, a hermaphrodite with a dog, a tattooed man, and an albino sword swallower. Nudist camps in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. Disneyland and a Hollywood set for their dead or fake landscapes without people, and the unidentified mental hospital where she took some of her last and most disturbing photographs. And there was always daily life, with its endless supply of oddities, if one has the eye to see them. The camera has the power to catch so-called normal people in such a way as to make them look abnormal. The photographer chooses oddity, chases it, frames it, develops it, titles it. You see someone on the street, Arbus wrote, and essentially what you notice about them is the flaw. The insistent sameness of Arbus's work, however far she ranges from her prototypical subjects, shows that her sensibility, armed with a camera, could insinuate anguish, kinkiness, mental illness with any subject. 2 photographs are of crying babies. The babies look disturbed, crazy. Resembling or having something in common with someone else is a recurrent source of the ominous, according to the characteristic norms of Arbus's disassociated way of seeing. It may be 2 girls, not sisters, wearing identical raincoats whom Arbus photographed together in Central Park, or the twins and triplets who appear in several pictures. Many photographs point with oppressive wonder to the fact that 2 people form a couple, and every couple is an odd couple, straight or gay, black or white, in an old age home or in a junior high. People looked eccentric because they didn't wear clothes like nudists, or because they did, like the waitress in the nudist camp who's wearing an apron. Anybody Arbus photographed was a freak, a boy waiting to march in a pro-war parade, wearing a straw boater and his bomb Hanoi button. The king and queen of a senior citizens dance, a 30ish suburban couple sprawled in their lawn chairs, a widow sitting alone in her cluttered bedroom. In A Jewish Giant at Home with His Parents in the Bronx, New York, 1970, the parents look like midgets, as wrong-sized as the enormous son, hunched over them under their low-ceilinged living room. The authority of Arbus's photographs derives from the contrast between their lacerating subject matter and their calm, matter-of-fact attentiveness. This quality of attention, the attention paid by the photographer, the attention paid by the subject to the act of being photographed, creates the moral theater of Arbus's straight-on contemplative portraits. Far from spying on freaks and pariahs, catching them unawares, the photographer has gotten to know them, reassured them, so that they pose for her as calmly and stiffly as any Victorian notable sat for a studio portrait by Julia Margaret Cameron. A large part of the mystery of Arbus's photographs lies in what they suggest about how her subjects felt after consenting to be photographed. Do they see themselves, the viewer wonders, like that? Do they know how grotesque they are? It seems as if they don't. The subject of Arbus's photographs is, to borrow the stately Hegelian label, the unhappy consciousness, but most characters in Arbus's Grand Guignol appear not to know that they are ugly. Arbus photographs people in various degrees of unconscious or unaware relation to their pain, their ugliness. This necessarily limits what kind of horrors she might have been drawn to photograph. It excludes sufferers who presumably know they are suffering, like victims of accidents, wars, famines, and political persecutions. Arbus would never have taken pictures of accidents, events that break into a life. She specialized in slow-motion private smash-ups, most of which had been going on since the subject's birth. Though most viewers are ready to imagine that these people, the citizens of the sexual underworld as well as the genetic freaks, are unhappy, few of the pictures actually show emotional distress. The photographs of deviates and real freaks do not accent their pain, but rather their detachment and autonomy. The female impersonators in their dressing rooms, the Mexican dwarf in his Manhattan hotel room, the Russian midgets in a living room on 100th Street, and their kin are mostly shown as cheerful, self-accepting, matter-of-fact. Pain is more legible in the portraits of the normals, the quarreling elderly couple on a park bench, the New Orleans lady bartender at home with a souvenir dog, the boy in Central Park clenching his toy hand grenade. Broussard denounced the photographers who try to trap their subjects off guard, in the erroneous belief that something special will be revealed about them. In the world colonized by Arbus, subjects are always revealing themselves. There is no decisive moment. Arbus's view that self-revelation is a continuous, evenly distributed process is another way of maintaining the Whitmanesque imperative. Treat all moments as of equal consequence. Like Broussard, Arbus wanted her subjects to be as fully conscious as possible, aware of the act in which they were participating. Instead of trying to coax her subjects into a natural or typical position, they are encouraged to be awkward, that is, to pose. Thereby the revelation of self gets identified with what is strange, odd, askew. Standing or sitting stiffly makes them seem like images of themselves. Most Arbus pictures have the subjects looking straight into the camera. This often makes them look even odder, almost deranged. Compare the 1912 photograph by Lartigue of a woman in a plumed hat and veil, race course at Nice, with Arbus's Woman with a Veil on Fifth Avenue, New York City, 1968. Apart from the characteristic ugliness of Arbus's subject, Lartigue's subject is just as characteristically beautiful. What makes the woman in Arbus's photograph strange is the bold unself-consciousness of her pose. If the Lartigue woman looked back, she might appear almost as strange. In the normal rhetoric of the photographic portrait, facing the camera signifies solemnity, frankness, the disclosure of the subject's essence. That is why frontality seems right for ceremonial pictures, like weddings, graduations, but less apt for photographs used on billboards to advertise political candidates. For politicians, the three-quarter gaze is more common, a gaze that soars rather than confronts, suggesting instead of the relation to the viewer to the present, the more ennobling abstract relation to the future. What makes Arbus's use of the frontal pose so arresting is that her subjects are often people one would not expect to surrender themselves so amiably and ingenuously to the camera. Thus, in Arbus's photographs, frontality also implies in the most vivid way the subject's cooperation. To get these people to pose, the photographer had to gain their confidence, has had to become friends with them. Perhaps the scariest scene in Todd Browning's film, Freaks, 1932, is the wedding banquet when pinheads, bearded women, Siamese twins, and living torsos dance and sing their acceptance of the wicked normal-sized Cleopatra, who has just married the gullible midget hero. One of us, one of us, one of us, they chant as the loving cup is passed around the table from mouth to mouth, to finally be presented to the nauseated bride by an exuberant dwarf. Arbus had a perhaps oversimple view of the charm and hypocrisy and discomfort of fraternizing with freaks. Following the elation of discovery, there was the thrill of having won their confidence, of not being afraid of them, of having mastered one's aversion. Photographing freaks had a terrific excitement for me, Arbus explained. I just used to adore them. Diane Arbus's photographs were already famous to people who follow photography when she killed herself in 1971. But as with Sylvia Plath, the attention her work has attracted since her death is one of another order, a kind of apotheosis. The fact of her suicide seems to guarantee that her work is sincere, not voyeuristic, that it is compassionate, not cold. Her suicide also seems to make the photographs more devastating, as if it proved the photographs to have been dangerous to her. She herself suggested the possibility. Everything is so superb and breathtaking. I am creeping forward on my belly like they do in war movies. While photography is normally an omnipotent viewing from a distance, there is one situation in which people do get killed for taking pictures, when they photograph people killing each other. Only war photography combines voyeurism and danger. Combat photographers can't avoid participating in the lethal activity they record. They even wear military uniforms, though without rank badges. To discover, through photographing, that life is really a melodrama, to understand the camera as a weapon of aggression, implies that there will be casualties. I'm sure there are limits, Arbus wrote. God knows, when the troops start advancing on you, you do approach that stricken feeling where you perfectly well can get killed. Arbus's words, in retrospect, describe a kind of combat death. Having trespassed certain limits, she fell in a psychic ambush, a casualty of her own candor and curiosity. In the old romance of the artist, any person who has the temerity to spend a season in hell risks not getting out alive or coming back psychically damaged. The heroic avant-gardism of French literature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries furnishes a memorable pantheon of artists who failed to survive their trips to hell. Still, there is a large difference between the activity of a photographer, which is always willed, and the activity of a writer, which may not be. One has the right to, may feel compelled to, give voice to one's own pain, which is, in any case, one's own property. On the other hand, one volunteers to seek out the pain of others. Thus, what is finally most troubling in Arbus's photographs is not their subject at all, but the cumulative impression of the photographer's consciousness, the sense that what is presented is precisely a private vision, something voluntary. Arbus was not a poet delving into her entrails to relate her own pain, but a photographer venturing out into the world to collect images that are painful. And for pain sought rather than just felt, there may be a less than obvious explanation. According to Wilhelm Reich, the masochist's taste for pain does not spring from a love of pain, but from the hope of procuring, by means of pain, a strong sensation. Those handicapped by emotional or sensory analgesia only prefer pain to not feeling anything at all. But there is another explanation of why people seek pain, diametrically opposed to Reich's, that also seems pertinent. They seek it not to feel more, but to feel less. Insofar as looking at Arbus's photographs is undeniably an ordeal, they are typical of the kind of art popular among sophisticated urban people right now, art that is a self-willed test of hardness. Her photographs offer an occasion to demonstrate that life's horror can be faced without squeamishness. The photographer once had to say to herself, "Okay, I can accept that." The viewer is invited to make the same declaration. Arbus's work is a good instance of a leading tendency of high art in capitalist countries to suppress or at least reduce moral and sensory queasiness. Much of modern art is devoted to lowering the threshold of what is terrible. by getting us used to what, formerly, we could not bear to see or hear, because it was too shocking, painful, or embarrassing. Art changes morals, that body of psychic custom and public sanctions that draws a vague boundary between what is emotionally and spontaneously intolerable and what is not. The gradual suppression of queasiness does bring us closer to a rather formal truth, that of the arbitrariness of the taboos constructed by art and morals. But our ability to stomach this rising grotesqueness in images, moving and still, and in print, has a stiff price. In the long run, it works out not as a liberation of, but as a subtraction from the self. A pseudo-familiarity with the horrible reinforces alienation, making one less able to react in real life. What happens to people's feelings on first exposure to today's neighborhood pornographic film or to tonight's televised atrocity is not so different from what happens when they first look at Arbus's photographs.